By the time this child graduates from high school, her brain will have absorbed 350,000 television commercials, 100,000 alcohol ads, and a daily barrage of sex and violence. If that doesn't turn you off, then nothing will. A message from the Media Foundation.
This project is sponsored in part by Sylvan Realty, Chatham's hometown real estate broker, whether you're moving in or moving on. And by Artscape and the Cape Cod Bank and Trust. When we were some 6 leagues from Malabar, we cast anchor near the shore because the wind was not favorable. Along this coast, we observed smoke, which the Indians were making, and this made us decide to go and visit them. Finally, by God's favor, we succeeded in passing over a sandy point which projects about 3 leagues into the sea to the south-southeast, making a very dangerous place. Here there is much cleared land and many little hills whereon the Indians cultivate corn and other grains on which they live. Here are likewise very fine vines, plenty of nut trees, oaks, cypresses, and a few pines. This would prove a very good site for laying and constructing the foundation of a state, if the harbor were a little deeper and the entrance safer than it is. Samuel de Champlain, 1606.
Samuel de Champlain guided his crippled vessel past Harding's Beach and into Stage Harbor in October of 1606. He stepped onto the beach here as the first white man recorded on these shores, though the waters off Chatham had been consistently navigated by European explorers and fishermen for at least 100 years. In fact, the Native Americans here who called themselves the Monomoit greeted the party of French explorers enthusiastically, paddling out to meet the ship in their canoes and already speaking bits and pieces of various European languages. But Champlain's written account was no doubt the first to record the impressions that this land made on the European mind, the layout of its harbors and cornfields, the culture of the 500 or 600 natives that had lived here for the past 10,000 years. Unfortunately, Champlain's landing also marked another historic first. Here also was shed the first blood between Europeans and the natives of New England. 2 weeks of increasingly uneasy contact erupted into a fatal skirmish under circumstances that are still unclear. 3 of the Frenchmen were killed and 1 fatally wounded as they fled the shore. Many more Monomoit were killed by French musket shot. Champlain weighed anchor, giving up any ideas of making Chatham a French foundation of state, and leaving the way clear for the English. It wasn't until 50 years later, in 1656, when the first English settler ran a cart down the ancient Indian pathway with an eye on living here. Englishman William Nickerson struck a deal for 4 square miles of land with the Monomoic sachem Madaquasan. For this he promised a shallop, 10 coats, 6 kettles, 12 axes, 12 hoes, 12 knives, 40 shillings in wampum, a hat, and 12 shillings in coins.
And eventually the Crown Colony got wind of this. Crown Colony was well established in Plymouth by then. They got wind that this William Nickerson was upsetting the apple cart. He was dealing with the Indians on his own, and there was, to be valid, the deed had to go through the Crown Colony and then to him. So they fined him a substantial sum, and basically he said to Equity, I'm not gonna pay any fine. I did this dealing and it's mine. And they threatened to send the militia down, and he finally said, all right, I'm leaving. And when he came back, I think he kind of had reached some kind of decision in his own head that this was his land, and if the colony wanted to do something about it, fine, but he was sticking. It was bolstered by the fact that his kids had grown up some. He had 12 surviving children. And the girls were of marriageable age, and as a matter of fact, the very first daughter, Priscilla, married a released indentured servant from the up around Yarmouth somewhere. His name was Robert Eldred. We think that's where the Eldridges started. The Nickersons have been very good about keeping track of their who belongs to whom. The Eldridges are pretty sloppy about it. That's where we think the Eldridges came from, and we know the Nickersons came from this fellow that came over.
By 1682, Nickerson made additional purchases that would bring his land to a total of about 4,000 acres. He called this place Monomoit, as the Indians had known it, and immediately appealed to the court for incorporation of Monomoit as a town, but was refused on the grounds that there was no resident minister. Until that time, when there was a population sufficient to support a church, Monomoit would be known not quite as a town, but as a constable wick. Nickerson gave land to each of his 5 sons and 3 daughters, and built his house on Ryder's Cove, near this spot, now marked by the Nickerson Family Genealogical Research Center. The sachem Madaquasan also lived on Pleasant Bay, on a spot that is now littered with the remains of sea clams and oysters, dug up and carried here by the Monomoic natives themselves.
The sandy loam in the valleys was easy to till. The herring run in the spring furnished them with an ideal fertilizer for their plots of corn, beans, squash, and tobacco. The bay teemed with fish and fowl, and it was a rare winter indeed when enough ice formed to hinder the industrious squaws from rootling out a feed of clams or quahogs from the flats. W. Sears Nickerson.
A handful of settlers soon trickled in to join the Nickerson family here. The early houses were not much different from the infamous Cape Cod-style houses of today. They were built with low roofs to to withstand nor'easters and hurricanes and were often situated in protective hollows facing southerly for maximum exposure to the sun. In 1697, a meeting house was built on this site off today's Queen Anne Road. This was to become the first town center, an area now one of the quietest and least populated in town. The small farming village consisted of 20 or so families when Reverend Hugh Adams became the resident minister. Wasting no time, he drafted a second petition for incorporation that was subsequently approved in Boston with the condition that the Constablewick give up its Indian-derived name of Monomoit in favor of something a little more English. Finally, on June 11, 1712, the Constablewick of Monomoit was incorporated under the name of Chatham, taken from a seaport town in England. Despite its seaside orientation, the early settlement supported itself primarily on land rather than at sea. Early Chatham settlers cultivated such crops as corn, rye, wheat, and tobacco, and wildly growing hay was harvested far out on the salt marshes. The entire western portion of town was portioned off by wooden fencing as common land for the grazing of cattle and sheep. The typical family owned a horse or two for transportation, several oxen for work on the farm, and even sheep to provide wool for New England textile mills.
The first generation or two of settlers were no freer to choose their occupation than they were to choose their religion. They had to be farmers or starve, even if they came from London and had never drawn a furrow. Henry C. Kittredge.
Corn, introduced by the Monomoic natives centuries before, already grew readily here and soon became the town's principal crop. It was not only their food, it was their money too. In fact, the cultivation of corn was so important in Chatham that a law was passed in 1696 which stated that all householders were required to kill 12 blackbirds or 3 crows each year, delivering the heads to the selectmen or forfeit a tax of 6 shillings. How much corn a Chatham man had was the standard measure of his wealth or poverty, and these early farmers spent long hours working what they could from the land. It wasn't long, however, before the thin topsoil became exhausted or blew away entirely as the ancient forests of cedar, oak, and pine were cleared for fuel and construction. In 1815, the last 25 acres of Chatham's primeval forest was cut down in the South Chatham area of today's Forest Beach Road. The town was now so barren that in 1821, pines were planted in rows to keep the topsoil from blowing away entirely, the first known reforestation experiment in America. Farming continued on small holdings of land well into this century. In March of 1877, the Chatham Monitor proclaimed, "The blackbirds have a decidedly sober look, gathered in little knots in the trees, apparently talking over their experience on the late, rough voyage from the south, and laying their plans for the season's business in pulling corn and pulling peas." In the early part of this century, votes were still being cast at the town meeting to pay a bounty of 25 cents for each crow. As late as 1921, there were still 125 cows resident in town and 10 active farms. Another remnant of Chatham's agricultural heritage is this picturesque landmark, which once served a very practical purpose. Built in 1797 by Colonel Benjamin Godfrey, this windmill was then one of 6 in town, and it continued to grind corn until 1929, when a summer storm caused so much damage that it ceased operation. It was moved here to the head of Chase Park from its original site down near Stage Harbor, where it was a well-known navigation mark to sailors managing the unpredictable waters offshore. Now it is one of the last visible reminders of the importance of farming to the first people of Chatham. In 1766, a deadly smallpox epidemic ripped through the Chatham settlement, claiming the lives of 10% of the population, including some entire families. The town physician even succumbed as he went about comforting the others. Many houses were burned to the ground in an attempt to purge them of whatever evil spirit was causing the widespread sickness, and income was lost as family providers fell sick or died. Without a heavy tax system, the town now found itself unable to financially support such families in their calamity, without the generous aid of the neighboring villages. In 100 years, the Chatham settlers came to number 678, far beyond the tight, self-possessed group of Nickersons who had maintained common lands for the grazing of their cattle, and the once fertile soil yielded less and less each year. So it was natural that the Chatham men were turning to more fertile pastures, those of the sea. By the Revolutionary War, seafaring rather than farming was the prevalent occupation in town. Chatham, along with Harwich and Barnstable, dominated the Cape fishing industry with hauls of cod, mackerel, and halibut from the waters of the Grand Banks. Over 200 Chatham men and boys were making these dangerous but profitable runs, working to save enough money to buy their own vessel and skipper it, often before the age of 21.
See if we couldn't get a little more money coming from somewhere, so then they got off onto the water, fishing. And several of the fishermen, there's been kids who would start at 9, 10 years old, some of them be as a cook or cook's helper on a vessel, these two-masted fishermen especially. And then they'd grow up, by the time they were 15, they would be a pretty good man in the crew. By the time they were 17 or 18, they'd go on these deep water vessels. That is, they'd go from here to the Mediterranean or to Europe, China, all over the world. And by the time some of them were 21, they were captains of some of these vessels. And these were big square rig ships, barks and ships. They're probably anywhere from 100 to 150 feet long. They carried everything you could think of. Sugar, salt, ice, clothing, tea, everything you could think of they'd be carrying.
Fast, seaworthy vessels were built in town to haul salt cod down the colonial coast and into the West Indies. Stage Harbor was then a deep, bustling port, so named from the number of racks put there in operation to dry cod and mackerel. Reverend Adams had once reported to the governor, "We have a good harbor for a vessel of 50 tons to run into and ride anchor within musket shot of Oyster Cove and our Stage Neck." Just as the townspeople were throwing themselves wholeheartedly into their new occupation, the Revolutionary War erupted. Chatham's orientation as the easternmost land in the United States made her waters particularly appetizing to British raids and harassment. Thus, the economy of Chatham came to a virtual standstill. Her ships lay rotting in the harbor for most of the war, due to a standing British blockade on Cape ports, and the towns were often raided for food to feed the king's forces. All males of military age were in the Chatham militia, which drilled regularly on this now forested triangle of land called Training Field Road. The townspeople voted to provide each man with a good firelock, bullet pouch, powder horn or cartridge box, bayonet, cutlass or hatchet, 20 bullets, a knapsack and blanket. And so Chatham men were pulled reluctantly from baiting their fish lines. Campaigning in Rhode Island when their boats and families lay exposed on the elbow of Cape Cod was not exceedingly popular. Yet the muster rolls in the Massachusetts State Archives say that a company of Chatham men, commanded by Captain Benjamin Godfrey, was even at the Battle of Bunker Hill. One of them, Stephen Nickerson, great-grandson of William, was signed on as a fifer. Most of them, however, served on privateers, raiding British commerce. Chatham itself did see first-hand involvement when a British privateer sailed into its harbor one night to capture a brigantine anchored there. As the British were raising their flag, Captain Godfrey's arriving militia fired on her and recaptured the ship, sending the British back past Monomoit and into the Atlantic.
Fire!
In 1783, when the war was over, Cape Cod prepared to rebuild its devastated economy, and Chatham men went back to making a living. In 1775, there were 30 fishing vessels. By the war's end, only 4 remained. But by 1800, the town center had already begun to shift to the area of today's Chatham Light, so as to be close to the harbor and wharves. Whales were plentiful along the outer beach in these early years, and Chatham men kept cedar whaleboats permanently on the bluffs of Shore Road. According to W. Sears Nickerson, everyone in town owned shares in the whaleboat.
Ensign William was a shore whaler, and a wild yell of "Towner!" the Cape Cod Indian equivalent for "Thar she blows," often re-echoed from the tall cliffs of High Scattery as he and his Indian crew launched their 5-handed whaleboat in pursuit of Leviathan.
In 1817, the government passed the Federal Navigation Law, which required all domestic cargo to be transported exclusively in American ships. Chatham ports were soon launching sloops and schooners all along the coast. George's Bank was found to be a much closer alternative to the Grand Bank. A fast schooner could make the trip out in 10 hours and be back in the same time with her hatches bursting. Crews consisted of 5 or 6 friends or family members, all in for a percentage of the trip's profit.
Chatham had a lot of sea captains. There was, I've got records of over 750 of them that Chatham had. This is all, fishermen. That's the schooner fishermen that went to Grand Banks, all that type of fishermen, right on up to the deep water men that went to Orient, wherever they went. We had over 750 from this little town. But the Cape Cod as a whole had, I think, more sea captains than anywhere in the country ever had. Yeah. There were a pile of them then.
By 1860, the fishing industry was at its height. But again, Chatham men would soon be forced into abandoning their dories. During the Civil War, the little town of Chatham sent 292 men, more than its quota for a town of about 2,600, and the casualties were high. Many of them died at Cold Harbor, Spotsylvania, Petersburg, and at Andersonville Prison in Georgia. In fact, the 33rd Massachusetts had only 12 men remaining of its original 1,000 by June of 1864. One Chatham boy, witnessed a particularly momentous battle. 16-year-old James Freeman Clark was there to witness the legendary Monitor and Merrimac fight. In his old age, he often recounted the story of sculling alongside the Monitor in a small dinghy and excitedly running his hand over the cannonball dents in her side. After the Civil War, the arrival of the railroad on Cape Cod caused the town center to shift inland again to today's present location. The fishing industry would never again reach the level it had in 1860 before the war. Deep-sea fishing became more and more centered off Cape around the large harbors of Gloucester and Boston.
Quite a number of our enterprising young men went off to Boston last week to go to sea, among whom we hear of Cornelius Mayo, Charles Atwood, Willie Harding, Nathaniel Kendrick, Solomon Atwood, and Benjamin Mallows. The failure of the fishing business rather compels them to go away, who otherwise would find employment at home. The Chatham Monitor, 1880.